When I fall in love, I get dizzy. I fall out there just
This is Historical Hotties, a podcast where we go through different categories of historical figure and try and figure out which one is the biggest babe.
still.
Hello, and welcome to another installment of Historical Hotties. We're about to do this thing. I am one of your two hosts, Whitney Nelsen, and this is my sister from the same mister,
Lindsey Nelsen.
Here's the lowdown. We chose a category of historical figure together, and then separately, each one of us chose a secret person that we think is the hottest in that category. We then give each other, and you lovelies, our bio on the pick. We then rank our hotties in 4 separate categories, and those categories are physical attractiveness, mental attractiveness, social impact, and je ne sais quoi. Lindsay, would you like to start us off?
Thanks, Daddy-O. So our category today is beatniks, snaps, and my choice for hottest beatnik is Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes was born James Mercer Langston Hughes in February of 1902 and is one of the leading figures of the beatnik movement and of the Harlem Renaissance. He was born to mixed-race parents. Both of Hughes's paternal grandmothers were enslaved African Americans, and both of his paternal grandfathers were white slave owners in Kentucky. So he had a very complicated feeling about race and about being American and African and everything that all of that meant. And he would get accused over his life and career of both being too African and not African enough by different parties. But one of the most notable things about Hughes and his work was, as part of the Harlem Renaissance, he was a big advocate of the idea that art did not have to follow a classical European style to be fine art or high art. That more folk styles or street styles could be as refined and high examples of art as any other, that you didn't have to be writing Shakespearean sonnets. And he really encouraged a lot of people, especially in Harlem, and especially a lot of African American artists, to express their art in ways that felt more true to them. His grandmother was a famous oral storyteller and historian, and those rhythms of sort of spirituals and folk tales really influenced his poetry. Of course, his talent was not confined to poetry. He wrote poetry, novels, autobiographies, operas, plays, pretty much anything that you could write and publish at the time, but was one of the first people to do what we are all very familiar with from So I Married an Axe Murderer, which is to have blues backing to your poetry, not to be singing your poetry, but just to be speaking it with sort of blues accompaniment. He spent a couple of years, actually it was a year that he was training to be a chemical engineer in college, but he spent most of his time in the blues clubs, and the rhythms and patterns of blues really affected the cadence of his poetry. But one of his biggest things was connecting Africa as a fountain of civilization in art. Instead of thinking of it as low, uncultured, and savage, to connect it to this refined history that goes back even further than a lot of European history. For instance, in one of his most famous poems, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, he connects a history of the Euphrates, the Congo, the Nile, and brings it all the way up to the Mississippi. And he associated a lot of qualities that people use to refer to African Americans with a negative connotation, like muddy coloring, and used adjectives like burnished and mahogany and associated positive things with characteristics that had been culturally associated as negative. One of the things I also really love about him is the way that he continued to encourage and sort of promote and sponsor newer artists. Once he became established as an artist, he spent a lot of his time finding young artists he thought were doing quality work in all different fields and genres, and introducing them to people who could help them, promoting them, and becoming patrons of their art. So, Langston Hughes is my pick for hottest beatnik.
So my pick is Jack Kerouac, which may be a scoffably obvious pick. But, okay, so there are many people known off the tip of your tongue as the core of the beat poet generation. Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac. There's a few other in there who are, a little bit in that core nucleus, but those are the main ones who coined the term beat generation, who really were the driving factors in it. And Jack Kerouac is credited by many of them as kind of being the father of it. He was younger than some of the other people in the group. He wasn't as initially successful as some of the others in the group, but he is widely credited as sort of being the heart of it. He was born in 1922 in Massachusetts, but his parents are from Quebec, and he grew up speaking French before he spoke English until he was 6. His dad owned a print shop, so I know there was a little bit of literature to some extent, the publishing business at home when he was growing up, but mostly what there was when he was growing up was Catholicism. That was like a big thing with Kerouac. He ended up getting a football scholarship to Columbia, and this is kind of back in the days where football was less a contact sport and more a die early at a young age from a severed spinal cord sport. That's a tongue twister for you. Severed spinal cord sport. And so he ended up, I believe he was in Columbia for a very short period of time before he broke his tibia and kind of ended his football career. And that ended up with him dropping out of school and living in New York. He definitely was influenced by Harlem, pre-Beat Generation, pre-Langston Hughes influence. But the main thing that, both Kerouac and kind of the rest of the Beat Generation was known for is unedited introspection. Sometimes that's negative. There's a lot of, depending on the mood of any of these beats, you get very opening, welcoming. They are more integrated in their novels than society is, so there's a lot more positivity about people of color. There's a lot more openness about homosexuality and drugs and sexuality in general. But then sometimes you turn around and there's raging misogyny and they're using horrific racial terms and things are not painted in such a good light. And part of that is because they all wrote with the idea of spontaneous prose as sort of the core of what they did. In fact, Jack Kerouac actually taped pages together. He would spend years sort of coming up with the idea for a novel, but then actually write it in 20 days. It was always mad fits of writing where he would tape paper together so that it could go through the typewriter in one continuous scroll and he wouldn't have to stop for days and days on end. And then he would never edit it. And in fact, later on, when he became more well-known, it was actually in his clauses that no one could edit it. Not even his editor. So you came with a whole different sense of whirlwind composition and stream of consciousness thought, and sometimes that was really positive and going against the grain, and sometimes that was not so positive and a bunch of inexperienced boys thinking that they're thinking great thoughts when really it's just sort of self-indulgent thoughts. But Jack Kerouac is, well, a lot of people call him the king. He's really kind of the heart of the Beat Generation. He was a really sensitive guy. He cared a lot about his friends. And, one of his most famous quotes is, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles." And, that says a lot about him. He was not always the smartest guy, and he died from alcoholism and an abdominal hemorrhage because he got into a bar fight and his liver thinned his blood too much. He died at 47, so he was pretty young. And honestly, his career had only been going for about 13 years or so. It took him a very long time to be successful and published. Wayward and rebellious at the same time that he was very caring and very sensitive. And so he's my pick.
Interesting, yeah. So let us move on to our rubric of rating these historical hotties.
Mm-hmm.
On the first category, physical attractiveness, how do you rate Kerouac?
10.
Wow, you really
Yeah.
like that James Deany thing, don't you?
Yes. Very James Deany, very jaw, very eyes, kind of the big, not quite as coiffed in the hair with like a pomp.
With the pompadour, yeah.
Not quite as much, but it was like big dark hair. But, you know, he definitely had a very James Deany sort of quality. And in fact, I would even say he was more in the like dark, handsome area than James Dean was. He was not tall. He was about 5'8", so, you know, not short, but definitely not like a giant strapping man. But he had very, very dreamy eyes and really cut jaw and just like classic good looks.
Okay, I don't know that he's quite as much of my wheelhouse as he seems to be yours, but I would give him a 4. I think he's a solid 4 in that, like, James Deany classic American way.
Whoa. Whoa.
What? A 4 out of 5 is not a diss, Whitney. You can't inflate the scale to a 10 just because you really like Jack Kerouac.
4 out of 5 is fine, and I rate 5 out of 5.
Yes, that's how I was interpreting your 10.
I know, but still, he's just really hot, guys.
Yeah. So, there's something about Langston Hughes that I find particularly adorable, especially in his early 20s. He had this lanky, you know, energetic thing going on. He had thick, tousled hair, really twinkly eyes. I like his dapper pinstripe suit and tiny mustache look. I think he really works that. But the thing that I find most attractive physically about Langston Hughes is his voice. He has this voice with this very lively, amber sort of timbre to it. Langston Hughes' voice sounds like violin resin smells. It's
Okay.
It's sort of this amber, bright, polished wood library sort of sound.
Okay.
I really like Langston Hughes' voice.
Okay.
So, and I think he's super adorable and dapper. So I think that he's at least a 4 out of 5.
A 4, okay. I don't disagree with most of the things that you said. I think, in general, it is my opinion that mixed-race babies are the prettiest babies. So I definitely think he's got a lot of good characteristics going on. I don't like a thin mustache on anybody, no matter how well they work it.
I think he makes it work. It's not a thing that I usually go for. I'm just saying, with the whole Langston Hughes picture, I think it works.
And for me, he is tall and lanky, which I do like a lot. I think his hair was great. I think his eyes were great. I think a lot of things that you said were right. But he has a very baby face to me. It's very round. It's very youthful. Even when he was older, it was still round and youthful. And to me, that makes him kind of run-of-the-mill attractiveness of a 3.
You like some cragginess in there.
I mean, it doesn't have to be craggy, but it's a little bit over the top on babyface for me. So I'm gonna vote a 3.
Okay.
Which is, you know, it's still good. He's still hot, but not as hot.
Okay. All right. Mental attractiveness.
Like I said, there's as much engaging about Jack Kerouac as there is kind of frustrating and problematic, because it's all stream of thought and because it's self-indulgent and because a lot of these Beat Generation poets were white guys of a certain age who, you know, Jack Kerouac dropped out, but he still went to Columbia, and, you know, so there's a certain amount of privilege that came with abandoning everything and running off to traipse the world and learn about things.
This sort of slumming it by choice aspect. Yeah.
Yes, there's a definite slumming by choice aspect. That's exactly hitting the nail on the head. I'm gonna have to say, part of me wants to say 5, and then part of me wants to say 3, and I think I'm going with the 3 part because that's stronger. I think he's very influential and very smart, and I love the idea of not editing things and just writing what you feel and what you remember and what you see in front of you right now and going with that. But I do think that there's enough misogyny out of nowhere and racism out out of nowhere, when at some points they were so open about race and homosexuality and whatever and women, and then you turn around and the next second it's all negative and problematic. So I think 3 is my vote for Jack Kerouac.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you that there's something very magnetic about Kerouac and that whole passion for life and liking people who are kind of burning bright and mad. But the problem with people being Roman candles is that they burn you and they go out really quickly. And, you know, that manic energy, which is one of the things that's so compelling about his work, and that raw honesty, is also not exactly who I want to, like, hang out and have dinner with on a Sunday night. I mean, right. Jack Kerouac would be exhausting. Like, just... And the random bursts of misogyny and homophobia and stuff, he is definitely part of the mid-century misogynists.
Well, and also the sheer amount of drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
I mean, he got into a bar fight and died like 5 days later because his body just couldn't handle getting into a bar fight.
Yeah, a punch was too much with the state of all of the drugs and alcohol.
Yeah. So what's your numerical vote?
So I'm gonna... my first impulse was a 3, too. I occasionally wavered to like a 2 because he just sounds like exhausting and like so much work. But I do think that there is something to be admired in that kind of honesty and willingness to throw yourself into things.
Totally.
Obviously, it should be tempered with a little bit of... So I'm going to agree with you and say a 3. Like, I think that's fair.
And then I'm just going to jump in before you, and you can talk more about the mental attractiveness of Langston Hughes. But I think, first of all, his mental attractiveness carried on long after the Beat Generation, because the Beat Generation was sort of like a flare that burned very quickly and then died very quickly. It was not very long that the Beat Generation was in its prime, and Langston Hughes was in his prime for basically ever. Yeah,
he had a good solid 30 years of interesting creative work.
But also, while he participated in a lot of things that the Beat Generation was about, and looking at the way society was built and a lot of stuff like that, he also was very, very thoughtful about it in a way that, like, William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac were not. And I think a lot of that had to do with his complicated past with America and with his grandparents and his history, and I also think he was maybe more just like a sensitive, thoughtful person in general. Mm-hmm. But I'm just gonna go ahead and say that he ranks like a 4.5 for me.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's fair. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think he was, a little bit more sensitive and thoughtful than a lot of the beatniks. He was more retrospective than a lot of the beatniks. I think you were very right in saying his influence sort of carried on and evolved more than the brief flare. Like, Beatnik Generation had a lot of influence on future artists, but he continued to evolve past that point. I love his real dedication to the idea that art is anything that you approach with real emotion and artistry, and it doesn't have to fit a sort of set of Academy rules to qualify as fine art. That anything that communicates emotion and is beautiful and moves somebody is art. I think that was really important, and his dedication to civil rights and to bringing on other artists and stuff, I think that he is a 5 as far as mental attractiveness goes.
Okay.
I like somebody that dedicated to their ideals.
Yeah, absolutely. Social impact, I'm just going to let you know right now, I vote both of them for different reasons, but we've kind of covered social impact in the mental attractiveness.
A lot of their impact.
Social impact, I think, as far as the beats go, Jack Kerouac had the most. I think he was not necessarily the oldest of the Beat Generation or the more experienced, but I think he impacted the rest of his friends and that social circle more than almost anyone else did.
And I agree with you that he's sort of the quintessence of Beatnik. That when most people think of Beatnik, Jack Kerouac would be the first person to come to mind. Maybe Burroughs, but probably Kerouac.
Yeah. And I do, obviously Langston Hughes was not as popular in the beat movement, but lasted much, much longer and had more important stuff to say. So I think that kind of between the amount of immediate impact on, like, social awareness that Jack Kerouac had, measured against a very kind of long, slow burn of Langston Hughes' impact, gives them both a 4 for me.
Yeah, I will second that. I think they both get a 4 in different ways.
Okay, so now we're at Je ne sais quoi.
I think Langston Hughes had that really lively twinkle a lot of times. He also would have periods of sort of malaise, like when he was traveling and stuff. He was very unhappy a couple of the times that he traveled, and visiting his father, who was estranged from in Cuba, would send him into periods of depression and stuff like that. So, but of course it's probably good for us that he did, because he said that he never wrote a good poem when he was happy. So it's one of those things, like, you need people to keep breaking up with Adele to get more of those songs. Like, you need Langston Hughes to have fits of malaise. I would say that he's a 3 in Je ne sais
Okay.
quoi. I love passion, and there's a steadiness there that, while comforting, isn't the most, like, lively.
Okay. For me, both your pick and my pick rank a 5 in Je ne sais quoi. When it comes to the Beat Generation and, you know, Jack Kerouac specifically, with the travel everywhere you can, meet everyone you can, learn everything you can, incredibly engaging. And regardless of the narcissism or the self-focus that the Beat Generation had that kind of led to a lot of failings, I think that that's an incredibly attractive, sort of indefinable allure. And then Langston Hughes, I mean, obviously anyone who is a big figure in civil rights, that sort of fight, and even if it's a lower key malaise sort of fight, like Langston Hughes had, that sort of drive to say, this is how we got here, something needs to change, also ranks very, very high in Je ne sais quoi for me, just kind of across the board with everybody. So for me, for both picks, for both Langston Hughes and Jack Kerouac, I rate a 5 in Je ne sais quoi, because I think both of them have that sort of indefinable attractiveness.
Well, I definitely think there's indefinable attractiveness in both of them, but my reason for the 3 is only that he'd have these big sort of withdrawn periods. So while he was engaged and active and passionate, he was incredibly magnetic. He would go through big sort of periods where he pulled into himself, and that's the only reason for that rating. I think at his peak, like when he was really vibrant with the energy and the passion, he was easily a 5. And I would say Kerouac, my feelings about Kerouac are kind of what we talked about in mental attractiveness, is that he was in that manic energy that can be incredibly magnetic and you can't look away from, but is also kind of violent, you know, and dangerous and attractive in that sort of way, but also kind of a little bit off-putting, which is the unpredictability and the mercurial sort of nature, I would say is a 4.
Okay. I do think you're ascribing some of Beat in general. I think you're ascribing some Burroughs-ness and some Ginsberg-ness into Kerouac. I think he was a little bit more soulful and a little bit less... violent is not the right word, but I see where you're getting at with that. And I feel like... just
in the violent unpredictability. He didn't have nearly the aggressiveness of, like, Burroughs, who was incredibly aggressive against pretty much everybody in his poetry.
All right, so we have the final tally. And this is always fun for Lindsay, because I do the tallying on my end and she can't see it.
So it's a mystery.
So she never knows who wins until I announce it.
Because I am not doing the math in my head.
So, the winner by 0.5 points is Langston Hughes. We have 32 points for Jack Kerouac and 32.5, that was my 0.5 for mental attractiveness, to Langston Hughes.
Yeah. Woo!
All right, everybody, that about wraps up this episode of Historical Hotties. Thanks for joining us. You can find us on Twitter at historicallyhot, and join us again soon.
Yeah, let us know on Twitter what you thought, who your pick is, and if you thought we missed somebody glaringly obvious in this category.
All right, see you later.
Thank you.
Can't regret my